Hi, I'm Georgina.
And I'm Jieling. And we're the curators for Human Nature.
Today we're going to share with you some of our favorite items from the exhibition.
Let's go!
The first section of the exhibition is titled Understanding Nature and explores the study of natural history in Singapore and the region. Southeast Asia is one of the most biodiverse areas of the world. In Singapore alone, there are over 40,000 species of plants and animals. The flora and fauna of the region have been studied for centuries, and a great depth and breadth of environmental knowledge has been accumulated across its communities. From the 17th century, increased trade and European colonization in the region introduced a study of natural history defined as the description, naming, and classification of living things. These efforts intensified throughout the 18th century when the British and Dutch East India Companies began their commercial and colonial efforts in earnest. Naturalists and explorers poured into the area, eager to study foreign and exotic species. The European study of natural history was pursued in part for scientific interest and also because a thorough understanding of the environment was considered a key component of colonialism. This allowed colonial powers to seize control of merchant economies, which relied heavily on the trade of natural resources such as spices, timber, and plantation agriculture. This intensive period of study has resulted in a large body of printed work, primarily by European authors.
Okay, so here's our first item. What we're looking at is a juvenile tapir specimen on loan from the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum, accompanied by a book from the National Library's own collection, which is William Farquhar's article on the Malayan tapir. This is a very well-traveled tapir because it's most often used to illustrate the unique politics that went on behind the study of natural history in the region. Throughout the 19th century, there were a lot of European naturalists studying the flora and fauna and the natural environment, but most of them were not full-time naturalists, they were just doing it on the side. One of these people was William Farquhar. So he's best known as being the first resident of Singapore, but prior to that, he was in Malacca. And while he was there, he acquired a specimen of a juvenile tapir, which he actually kept in his home. The tapir was apparently quite domestic, and he treated it almost like a pet dog, and he would feed it cake and bread at the table, which is very cute. But unfortunately, within 6 months, the tapir passed away, possibly from eating too much human food. Now, Farquhar wanted to be the first European person to publish a description of the tapir because that would normally mean that he gets to name it and he gets the credit for discovering the animal. However, in 1816, when he tried to publish his article, it wasn't published for 4 years. And in the meantime, Stamford Raffles, who was William Farquhar's rival, tried to get his publication withdrawn so that he could publish first. While this was going on, there were some French naturalists who found Farquhar's manuscript and also acquired a specimen of tapir of their own. They managed to publish before both Farquhar and Stamford, and eventually they were the ones who named the tapir Tapirus indicus. Follow me to the next item. Okay, so over here we have a showcase on the fish of the region. Now, Singapore is located on the extended coral triangle, which encompasses the seas around the Philippines, the Malay and Indonesian archipelago, which means that we have some of the most biodiverse waters in the world. However, if you look at publications from the 19th century, we see that a lot of them focus around fish as opposed to other marine life like corals and other things. This was primarily because fish were one of the key economic products of Malaya, and therefore more money and research was dedicated from the colonial government to this area. So it's interesting to see how, because of what is economic, that actually directs our knowledge of, the region's natural world based on, where research was headed. So over here we have a beautiful selection of books. This is the Atlas Ichthyologique, which was written by Peter Bleecker. He was a Dutch scientist who was working for the Dutch East India Company. So he went around the waters of the region, collecting fish specimens, describing them, and illustrating them as well. And as a result, we have 9 volumes of really beautiful illustrations of fish. So you can see we have frogfish, lionfish, and some moray eels as well, which is quite interesting. Now I'm going to bring us to this end of the showcase. Over here, we have a small publication on the crabs and crustaceans found in the coast of Singapore and Malaysia. This was done by Alfred Walker, who was actually in Singapore in the late 1800s. Now, most of the specimens he collected were from trawling the mangroves and the coasts.
So we have a lot of varied crab species there. We have also borrowed a tiny crab specimen from the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. It's of Singapore's very own Johora singaporensis, also known as the Singapore freshwater crab. This crab is only found in very specific areas in Bukit Timah, Bukit Gombak and Bukit Batok because it lives in very pure, untouched freshwater streams. Right, so you can see it's really, really tiny and it only appears in Singapore. So this was identified actually very recently because prior to this, a lot of scientists assumed that all freshwater crab species were sort of very similar, but it turns out they evolved so quickly that almost every stream has its own subspecies of crab. Okay, follow me to the next item. So over here what we have is a showcase featuring a very special monkey known as a burrow. So this is also known as a southern pig-tailed monkey. You can see here we have a specimen again on loan from the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. This monkey looks very strange because it's actually been folded in half. This was quite commonly used as a space-saving measure by the museum so that all the specimens could fit into drawers. But it still looks very fluffy and you can kind of see its little hands. Unfortunately, its face is squished, looks a bit like it's doing a yoga pose. But the story we're showing in this showcase is through two books. So one is the 1937 annual report from the Botanic Gardens and another one is a book called Botanical Monkeys because for a while, for a short period in the 1930s, the Singapore Botanic Gardens were actually using these burrows to collect specimens from trees. So the assistant director at the time was Henry Corner, and he was writing a book, The Wayside Trees of Malaya. And to do that, he had to take a lot of specimens from treetops, which were too high for humans to climb, and he also didn't want to have to chop down the tree just to collect specimens. So when he was traveling in Kelantan, he realized that a lot of households actually domesticated and trained burrows to climb coconut trees to collect coconuts. He bought his first botanical monkey named Mera from a man in Kelantan who actually sold it to him for almost 2 months' wages because he said that the monkey brought him in more money than any of his children when it came to collecting coconuts. So Corner brought these monkeys back to the Botanic Gardens and trained them to go on a long line up into the trees to shake the branches so that specimens would fall down and he would collect them, fruits and nuts and leaves and branches and things like that. It's quite amusing when you read his book, Botanical Monkeys. He describes how he trained them, how he had to bribe them to do what he wanted because they were very cheeky and they would just go up there and do whatever they liked. Unfortunately, most of these monkeys died in very horrible ways. So his first monkey, Mera, was actually poisoned by one of the palms that Corner accidentally told him to go out without realizing that it was poisonous to him. Another one of his monkeys, Corner, shot to death because as he grew older, he got very aggressive and he bit Corner and took out a chunk of his muscle in his arm, which left him with reoccurring infections for almost the rest of his life. According to the 1937 report, these monkeys were employed at Bukit Timah collecting specimens on an almost daily basis, and by the end of its life, Mera had collected about 300 different specimens of trees and plants. It's interesting because in the Botanic Gardens, in their herbarium, whenever they collect a plant specimen, there's a little label on the side listing the collector, and some of these monkeys are actually credited as the collector of the specimen, and it can still be found in the Botanic Gardens today. Now follow me to the next section where we'll meet up with Chia.
While Europeans and local naturalists explored and studied the natural world in Singapore and across Malaya, their work was conducted against a larger backdrop of environmental transformation. Consuming Nature shows another side of human-nature relationships during this period, of how humans, both local and immigrants, transformed Singapore's natural landscape through plantation agriculture. This section shows the different crops that were cultivated on the island from the 19th to 20th centuries, and the ecological effects that emerged in their wake.
Hi Chia, over to you.
Hi Georgina, thanks. So what we have here in this showcase is an 1898 map of the island of Singapore, and it actually features some of its earliest forest reserves. So by the end of the 19th century, right, actually 90% of our forests, of our primary forests had already been lost to plantation agriculture, namely that of gambia and pepper, as well as the felling of trees for timber, which was really destructive to the environment as well. So due to the rapid loss of forest cover and the emergence of forest fires due to the widespread lalang, that sort of proliferated across the Gambia and Pepper wastelands, as well as other adverse climatic effects, colonial authorities became super concerned about the state of the environment in Singapore. So Nathaniel Kentley, who was superintendent of the Botanic Gardens, he was actually commissioned, to reinvigorate the natural landscape. And to this end, he sort of proposed the gazetting of Singapore's first forest reserves, and which is what is shown on this map here. What's interesting is that the way we think of forest reserves today is really for conservation purposes, right? But actually, during the colonial era, forest reserves weren't for conservation. They were more for management, for the sustainable consumption of their resources. So in Singapore, we had three main types of forest reserves. So the first one is the town reserves, which included Pandan Reserve, and they were mainly used for the supply of timber for construction work. We also had coastal reserves, which were actually located at Seletar and Changi and other places. And these reserves were actually mainly for the supply of firewood for fuel, as well as to prevent soil erosion. And thirdly, we had interior reserves, which was located at the heart of Singapore Island, so close to what we know today as the Municipal Catchment Reserve. And the heart of the island, these reserves really protected the streams and the water supplies, such as the impounding reservoir. So on this map, the areas that are marked in green are actually the different forest reserves that existed in 1898, and there's about some 20 areas, that were here. So what's also interesting is also the work of the forest department, which really managed and oversaw the reserves. So we have here an annual report of the forest department, sort of detailing the work that they did. So one interesting thing they did was actually they planted various native and imported tree species, and so to sort of for shade, and for timber as well. And they would use it to sort of plant them for to prevent the proliferation of lalang across Singapore Island. So forest watchmen would actually go into the reserve, and they would sort of monitor the state of the trees in the reserve, and they would also sort of find any illegal loggers, because illegal logging was a very huge issue at the point of time. And they would also fight forest fires, when they occurred. So for the coastal reserves, they actually took boats out, to sort of survey, how the forest looked like from water. Okay, let's move on to our next showcase. Okay, so what we have here is a tiger specimen that we borrowed from the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum. So by the mid-19th century, Singapore actually sort of developed a reputation for having hordes of man-eating tigers that apparently infested the island. And this was because tigers were believed to have swum over to Singapore from the Malay Peninsula, and they came over here to sort of breed and to raise their young. And some of their favorite spots include the wooded hills of Bukit Timah and the sandy areas of Changi. So as humans sort of advance into the interior of Singapore Island, they're sort of interacting more, with the tigers that emerge in the forest edges. The chief victims, of tigers were actually plantation laborers. Most of them they were just clearing forests, to make plantations, and because tigers like to roam in the edges, that were created when forests were felled, mainly because it was a very good place to find prey. They eventually found a new prey, which was humans. So by the end of the century, most victims of tigers were actually Chinese plantation laborers, namely the Gambia and Pepper planters. And this was in contrast, to the people who lived in the town, namely the Europeans, who were really protected from the tiger threat because they were living in sort of the settlement area and away from the forest. Okay, so let's move on to our next item. So here we have an account of the first ever tiger hunt by the European community in Singapore, and this was in 1843, when basically a tiger fell into a pit in Bukit Timah Hill. And when the Europeans in town heard of it, a lot of them, they just rushed to Bukit Timah to look at the tiger, and to basically hunt it down. So the Europeans took turns shooting at the tiger in the pit, and when the tiger was almost dead, William Reed, who was the writer of this account, took a pole and he basically sort of stirred the tiger. And because the tiger got stirred, the tiger got really, really angry, and it basically leapt up close to the edge of the pit. And this made the Europeans really alarmed, And as he says here, they were basically tumbling over the roots and trunks of trees and over each other in the most ludicrous confusion. So basically the tiger almost jumped out, but it didn't, so it fell back into the pit, and Thomas Oxley, who was senior surgeon, shot it dead. and thus ends the first tiger hunt by the European community in Singapore. But this wasn't the first instance of a tiger being hunted in Singapore. So prior to Europeans hunting down tigers, Chinese plantation coolies were already starting to hunt tigers for the nice reward because by 1840s, the reward for hunting one tiger was actually about $50 per tiger, which was worth a lot in those days. So a plantation coolie managing to hunt one tiger or more than one tiger meant really a lot of reward for them. Okay, now that we're done here, let's move on.
Remaking Nature connects late colonial to contemporary efforts to conserve and restore Singapore's natural environment. In 1967, Singapore's first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew implemented the Garden City vision with the aims of improving the livability of a rapidly urbanizing city-state. Tree planting programs, newly created parks, and dedicated green spaces subsequently introduced greenery into urbanized areas. These efforts were accompanied by an increase in the protection of local biodiversity. As the aspirations and needs of each new generation of Singaporeans change, Singapore's land use policies have had to evolve accordingly. While population needs like public housing continue to be in high demand, green spaces have also become essential for public recreation. Today, this balancing of the needs of development and nature conservation continues.
So now we've fast forwarded to the 1960s, and what we have on show here are some vintage posters of Singapore's early tree planting movement and garden city movement from the National Archives collection. So it's quite interesting because the whole tree planting initiative in Singapore actually didn't begin with Lee Kuan Yew in the 1960s. It was started in the 1880s by the colonial government, who realized that there was a huge dearth of trees, especially in Singapore and in lots of Malaysia as well. So they started planting many different types of native and imported species of trees based on if they smelled nice, if they were ornamental, if they provided a lot of shade. So a lot of very common roadside trees or trees that we find in the secondary forests of Singapore, such as rain trees and even plants like the flame of the forest, as well as the African mahogany. A lot of them are imported plants, right? That were introduced during this time period. And many of them are heritage trees today because they've been around for a long time. So over here we have a beautiful poster titled Flowers of Singapore, but most of the flowers on here, such as the alamanda and the bougainvillea, are actually imported species. But it's really hard to imagine Singapore's landscape without these flowers now because they're everywhere on our overhead bridges, on all of our highways and expressways as well. And of course, we have over here a poster of the national flower, the Vanda Miss Joachim. So it's especially during the 60s and 70s that green urban environments and plants and flowers became a very strong part of Singapore's national identity as well. And the government especially was trying to push forward this idea of Singapore as a garden city. So we can look at more posters over on this side. So the first tree planting day started in 1971, and it was a nationwide movement to get everyone as far as possible to start being involved in the community effort to plant trees. So here we have a poster from 1973 as well as several others along the years of Tree Planting Day. Basically, it involves schools, community centers, and even the military as well, in all the different camps, getting together on one day in November usually to do a concerted tree planting effort. So even though the tree planting movement didn't start with the Garden City campaign, it was definitely expanded all over Singapore that way. It was a very popular movement, and every time the government announced new tree planting initiatives, places like the Singapore Botanic Gardens would become inundated with requests from the public asking, how do we plant trees, where do we find them, how do we maintain them? And so a lot of different guides to tree planting were also published, and the National Parks Board and the Parks and Recreation Board also started selling tree saplings to the public. So they could buy, for example, a durian tree or rambutan tree for about $5 and plant it wherever they think. Thanks for joining us for this quick tour of our favorite items from the exhibition.
See you soon. Bye.